Well, thank you very much, Christian, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center for putting together what, if I may say so myself, is an excellent initiative, the European Energy Security Initiative. Today we're going to be talking about Europe's energy security in the balance. What future for the Southern Energy Corridor? A fascinating topic. You know, even as other parts of the world are not only on CNN and on the radar screen, but in terms of energy are bubbling up. The Middle East, the Gulf in particular, and North Africa. Serious energy questions, regarding the nuclear question and so on, and what Japan might do down the road. Even as all these issues crop up and are in our immediate attention, interestingly enough, we also find that we're living in quite fascinating times when it comes to Europe's energy security, in particular what will be the fate of, or how will be realized what has been called the Southern Energy Corridor, particularly when it comes to natural gas, to the Caspian region, to the Middle East, through Turkey, most likely. And we have today with us three of the best people to speak about this. I mean, it's enormously topical because there's a number of sort of changes going on. I don't want to steal their thunder and talk too much about why this is, but I will just underscore that even while Libya is on your TV screens, there is, for those of us who have been watching developments in the Southern Energy Corridor, fascinating developments recently, just in these past few months. Talk about, for example, merging the projects of, the Western-oriented projects of the Southern Energy Corridor, something that has never come before and is now being talked about. The rival projects, if you will, what you might call the more north-south oriented projects or Russian-oriented projects like South Stream, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is now being talked about in ways very different from the way that it has been talked about so far. There's, of course, then the role of China, which is extremely important as a new player and an increasingly powerful player. I would argue, maybe my colleagues on the panel might argue a bit differently, but I would argue probably the most consequential energy player in Eurasia at the moment. Quite quickly came into that role, particularly in its relationship with Turkmenistan. And then, of course, the role of the United States. There's always this question when we have these topics, why does the U.S. care about European energy security so much? Or, for those of us who watch this quite closely, there's a question of not why does it care, but why is it that the United States seems to care more than some of its European allies about European energy security? And so all of these sorts of these questions and these topics, I think, will be addressed by the great panel that we have today. I'm going to briefly introduce all three of them, and then I think we'll begin with Andrea to my right. I'll begin in the order that they're going to speak. Andrea Waldman-Lockwood is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Eurasia, Africa, and the Middle East in the Office of Policy and International Affairs in the Department of Energy. In that capacity, she directs the analytical work covering the Eurasian landmass, including Russia, the Baltics, and Ukraine, Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Middle East, including Turkey, and Africa. She directs the policy and international representational activities with regard to this portfolio, bilaterally, multilaterally, and in conjunction with appropriate other U.S. government agencies. Andrea comes to this position with 25 years of experience at the Department of Energy, where she has served as Deputy Director for America's Policy, Senior Advisor to the Secretary for Africa Policy, and Lead Analyst for the Middle East, Central Asia, the UK, and Norway. Peter Doran, all the way to my left, is a Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, where he specializes in the geopolitics of energy and security. He has written extensively on the dynamics of oil and gas, energy security, and global politics, contributing articles for, amongst others, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, the Journal of Energy Security, World Politics Review, etc. He previously worked for the Jamestown Foundation and at Freedom House as an East Central Europe analyst for Freedom in the World. He's served as a Foreign Affairs Fellow in the U.S. Congress and the William H. Donner Fellow at the Organization of American States. And then finally, is Adnan Vatensever, Senior Associate in the Energy and Climate Program at the Carnegie Endowment. Just to my right, he specializes in the energy sectors of the former Soviet republics and Eastern Europe. His particular focus is on energy efficiency and carbon reduction and Russia's economic diversification. Before joining Carnegie, he was at Cambridge Energy Research Associates, IHS CERA, specializing in the oil and gas industries in Eurasia. His most recent areas of research include crew transportation and export dynamics in Eurasia, Russia's tax and regulatory environment for the oil sector, and Turkey's role as an energy transit country. And I think he's going to speak today both about Russia and Turkey in the dynamic of the Southern Energy Corridor. So as you can see, an excellent panel. I thank all of them for coming today, particularly Deputy Assistant Secretary Lockwood for taking time out of a very busy schedule to be here and address all of you. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to you.
Let's see how this works. Hi. I want to thank Christian, thank Alexandros, and thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me today. And it is a very interesting topic to the United States government, the Southern Energy Corridor and what the future holds. I think it's important to remember that the Southern Energy Corridor, like many plans for energy infrastructure, reflects how complex trying to make necessary energy investment decisions are and can be. You may have heard the President talking on this topic this morning, and we have a narrower focus today, but the issues are very complicated and very, very important. 10 years ago, if I had come to talk to you about natural gas in the United States and said that we would now have a glut of natural gas and that there would be a real possibility of LNG exports from the U.S., LNG export facilities in the Gulf of Mexico, you probably would have laughed. You might have even questioned my sanity. But it's an excellent example of how things change. At that time, the conventional wisdom dictated that natural gas production in the United States was in a terminal decline. We were looking at how we could import LNG, and today those import facilities that we built are sitting empty, and we're examining the economics of how we can export the gas from those facilities. So the advent of technologies has changed the gas market in the United States, and I would argue that it's changing the gas market in around the world and in the region that we're talking about, certainly in the gas market opportunities for Europe. We have the gas shale revolution. We have the production of new volumes, large new volumes in the Middle East that can be made into LNG for transport to European markets. There's the deregulation of the natural gas infrastructure in Europe. And there's been, I think most people would agree, a shift in the dynamics between Russia and the EU. With all of this going on, the European market is undergoing a period of profound transformation, looking at trading, looking at other opportunities to open it up and make it more flexible. So when we turn to the Southern Corridor, it represents a significant investment. It will provide diverse new supplies for Europe. And the position of the United States government on the project has been consistent from the time it was first conceived. We support a commercially viable Southern Corridor transit route. We think that any project coming out of the Southern Corridor will ultimately be driven by private investment, by profitability, by bankableness, if that's a word. And we believe that the market is the best determiner of what project will go forward. But we can look at what caused all this change in markets in Europe, change in the flexibility. We look at the gas crisis in January 2009, when a contractual dispute between the Ukraine and Russia resulted in the cutoff of natural gas supplies to Southeast Europe, 2 weeks in the middle of a very harsh winter. it was a watershed moment, and one that really changed, I think, the way Europe was thinking about natural gas. So in the wake of this event, European leaders made a lot of concrete moves to liberalize the continental gas markets and diversify sources of natural gas. The European Commission dedicated funds to build new interconnections between isolated gas markets in Eastern Europe and to look at and begin to develop LNG gasification facilities so they could bring in more sources from alternative places. Also, the EC moved to implement a new set of laws and regulations, and some of them are just coming through now in the third package, to mandate access to European natural gas infrastructure and enable the creation of markets that are not dominated by a single anti-competitive or monopolistic practice. The government of Russia gained a new understanding of the interdependence of their relationship with the European purchasers. They understood that they were as dependent on Europe as a source of a consuming source as Europe was on them as a source of supply. So they moved quickly to stabilize relationships with the Ukraine and sign new agreements so that a crisis like 2009 would not happen again. The 2009 crisis underscored the importance of having diverse sources of supply. And we're looking at that right now as Europe takes on the supply shortages or lack of supply from Libya. What happened then and what's happening now is that countries with multiple sources of supply, Germany, France, Italy, are able to substitute, while countries like Bulgaria, Serbia, which take all of their gas supplies from Russia, as was the case in 2009, at that time they had a humanitarian and economic crisis. We are looking at the lessons of 2009, the lessons of today, where the European market is ramping up purchases from Russia and Norway, drawing down existing stockpiles, substituting fuel sources, moving gas supplies from markets that are well served. These are all innovations since 2009. And then there are other means of strengthening Europeans' energy security that are relatively easy to implement. Pipelines can be made bidirectional. Storage capacity can be increased. Power generation can be built to use multiple fuel sources. And interconnectors can enable buyers and sellers to move that fuel around from markets that are better supplied. So we're seeing that European nations are already beginning to realize the benefits of access to diverse sources of gas. Traded volumes, you see trading now in continental hubs like the National Balancing Point in the UK, Baumgarten in Austria, the new hubs that barely existed a couple of years ago, NetConnect Germany, the title transfer facility in the Netherlands. These have been growing exponentially. It's too soon to tell how this is all going to shake out and how the EC's third legislative package of gas liberalization policies will affect markets. But there is the ability, Europe is beginning to feel the ability to look at diverse sources of supply, diverse markets, and this is particularly important in this time where we have the removal of the gas supplies from Libya. We have the increased demand for LNG from Japan as Japan responds to the damage from the tsunami and the earthquakes. And we do understand that a system that allows gas to move more easily where it's most needed and enables market participants to buy and sell gas with flexibility and reliability is going to be the way of the future. So all of these gains are happening, and Europe is unfortunately far from a monolithic entity. So there are places where severe vulnerability remains. Eastern Europe has a long way to go to gain the benefits of energy diversity that would bolster its energy security. Therefore, the Southern Corridor transit route would do a great deal to ensure diversity for those markets particularly and for all of Europe. The Southern Corridor isn't the only means of diversification for these markets. They could benefit from reverse flow capacity in the main Russia-Greek artery and the option of LNG capacity on the Adriatic or Greek coasts. The new European transmission system by MOL of Hungary is another very interesting opportunity to connect these previously isolated markets to one another. We are also pushing, from the United States point of view, and I think it's gotten a lot of traction in Europe, the more efficient use of hydrocarbon energy. And even in countries that produce gas, this is a good idea, because if you use less gas domestically, you will have more gas to export, and that increases the diversity. European countries are world leaders in energy efficiency, and they have 20-20-20 goals. That we think that energy efficiency plays an important role in the equation of diversity of gas supplies. So, with all of these sources of natural gas, will there be a need for the Southern Corridor? Unlike predicting gas shale 10 years ago, this is an easier prediction. My answer is yes. There will be a need for the Southern Energy Corridor. I think you can sort of put predictions in a pile with all of the predictions the U.S. government has made, but this one we believe is a safe one to make. There are negotiations with potential buyers and shippers of the gas underway. Potential shippers of the gas for major upstream supply, the Shah Deniz project in Azerbaijan, include the Nabucco Consortium, ITGI, and TAP. And they are lining up financing and putting in place organizational structures as we speak. The Shah Deniz 2 consortium has delayed, but it'll eventually give the nod to a project. Much of this decision is determined by what Turkmenistan decides to do, and I think, as Alexandros mentioned, China plays a role there. Turkmenistan is facing a drastically different market for gas than when the Cross-Caspian project was first conceived. And the opening of the Turkmenistan-China gas project pipeline means that China could overtake Russia as Turkmenistan's largest customer. So Turkmenistan increasingly has the power in these negotiations with its three main customers. And if it decides it wants to send gas to European markets, it better decide soon, because the decision to build a Southern Corridor project the size of that project will depend on what Turkmenistan's going to do. Beyond Turkmenistan, there's Iraq. And the size and the route of the Southern Corridor project will be determined in some part by what Iraq decides to do. The issue with Iraq there are several issues with the sales of gas from Iraq into the Southern Corridor. There's the stalemate between Baghdad and Erbil. There's the domestic needs for natural gas and electricity, which are coming to crisis proportions in Iraq. There's the idea that if you sell gas out of northern Iraq, you could use the resources to develop gas into the population centers from southern Iraq. Iraq has many things that it has to deal with and to face. There's the hydrocarbon law. So there will be some kind of decision, hopefully in the near future, out of Iraq as to how it's going to prioritize the competing demands for its gas. Expanding ties between Iraq and Turkey will be an important factor in Iraq's decision-making as well. As when it was conceived, the Southern Corridor continues to offer potential to add valuable diversification to the European portfolio and to connect the economies of the Caspian and Central Asia to those in the EU. Governments will play a role in determining the pipeline, the size, where the routing is, but in the end, it'll be the companies and the economics of the pipeline. So we feel strongly we will have a Southern Corridor gas pipeline in our future. Times have changed, energy markets have changed, and there are a lot of diverse sources of gas. But the challenge will be to realize the Southern Corridor that meets and fits in with this changing reality that we're facing. We want to build a Southern Corridor pipeline that does not close the door to expand its supplies from that region in the future. It may be time for companies to look at the best aspects of all of the projects and think about how we can get the Southern Corridor going now when it's needed, and we can achieve what may be a multi-phased southern corridor for the future. Thanks.
I think that's fascinating. You left us sort of tantalizing us with this idea of a multi-phase southern corridor. I think that may well come up in questions. I think I'll immediately hand over to Peter.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. And again, thank you to the Wilson Center. This is a fantastic opportunity because I really loved taking that 10-year snapshot, looking backwards and looking forwards, because if one thing is constant when it comes to the European energy sphere, is that it never really stays still for long. And what was relevant maybe 6 months, 12 months previous might not necessarily be as relevant 12 months, 6 months, or even 10 years ahead. Through my own work at the Center for European Policy Analysis, we focus on the 10 post-communist countries of the European Union. And 10 years ago, the European Union was far smaller, much more fractured when it comes to energy unification. And and the efforts put into creating a more coherent energy policy have reflected, in some extent, the steady expansion of the EU's priorities east, and then the integration of those new post-communist member states into the wider union. When I started thinking about this big picture, one thought really came to mind as I prepared to talk today, and that was a quote by Winston Churchill. When we look back at where Churchill was at the beginning of the century, when the world was in the middle of a transition from one fuel source to a new one, in this case coal to oil, in many ways it's similar that we're in a transition from oil to natural gas. These things happen in the life cycle of energy. But Churchill's quote on that transition, where he said that that mastery itself, in this case mastery of the seas, was the prize of the venture. All too often I wonder that as we talk about issues like the Southern Energy Corridor or energy security in wider terms, I wonder if we mistake the venture for the prize. The venture itself is actually quite straightforward. It is projects like Nabucco, projects like gas interconnectors, projects to increase European cohesion in both the regulation and implementation of wider energy objectives. But the prize itself is far different. That prize is meaningful, durable, and sustainable energy security. And this is not something we actually have at this point, maybe in Western Europe, but certainly not for the new member states, not yet. When we talk about this issue, a lot of times we come up with all sorts of dichotomies: supply and demand, upstream and downstream, winners and losers. Or in the case of the EU and its dealings with Russia, we also get energy rival or energy partner. Confusingly, the European Union tends to interchange these concepts frequently. But at the same time, this confusion, I think, is important because it indicates the depth of the waters that we're actually navigating when we tackle these very, very complex problems. And so in order to really crystallize what we're dealing with and the dilemma that both Europe and the United States face in attempting to establish that durable, sustainable, and meaningful goal of energy security, I'd like to throw in a new one. It's pretty straightforward: good news and bad. Because when we look back over the last 2 years, when it comes to the Southern Energy Corridor, I think we can see that there has been some remarkable progress and some rather frustrating lack of progress in realizing that goal, that prize. So because I'm an optimist, and I wanted to end on a more positive, hopeful note, I'll front load the bad news first. Remarkably, very little in the strategic level has changed since January 2009, during the pivotal, as you said, watershed, and I agree with that term, energy crisis resulting from a dispute between Russia and Ukraine. 2 years after that crisis, Central European states, members of the European Union, still demonstrate an alarming dependence on Russia's capricious energy politics. Countries such as Bulgaria, Hungary, and the Czech Republic are the most exposed, but other countries, such as the Baltic states, even Poland and Slovakia, are equally vulnerable. 2 years after the crisis, Central Europe still is also exposed to intense Russian commercial and political pressures. Examples of this can be seen in the case of Hungary and its ongoing struggle with the potential commercial takeover of a company like Surgutneftgaz, which is a murky Russian energy company with an even murkier ownership structure and non-transparent beneficiaries. Now, for their part, the Hungarians have actually pushed back, demanding that, and it's safe to say this is a reasonable demand, that Surgut disclose who actually stands to benefit from a 21% stake in their energy champion, MOL. This issue has been a persistent source of tension in the energy sphere between the Hungarians and the Russians, and also at the EU level. In fact, at the EU level, the Russians have actually allocated some rather considerable firepower. Vladimir Putin took up the issue personally in November 2010. Deputy Prime Minister Igor Sechin followed that in Brussels. And just this month, Russian Deputy Energy Minister Anatoly Yanovsky also followed up. So far, the Hungarians have held out against this pressure. At the same time, I think it really shows the true plight that a lot of these new member states face when they deal with far larger and far more powerful, in some ways, neighbors. But it's not just the Hungarians. Elsewhere in Bulgaria, also a keystone country in the Southern Energy Corridor, you see the Bulgarians trying to ease their dependence. They're completely dependent on Russian natural gas imports. You see the Bulgarians trying to ease their dependence on Russian imports by building a second nuclear reactor in the town of Belene. Now, this is a really interesting situation because although it's not directly related to hydrocarbons, this fusion, if you will, between nuclear and hydrocarbon energy sources has actually placed the Bulgarian government in a rather awkward position, having to go to the Russians to ask for financing and technical assistance in actually building the reactor itself. And thanks to some aggressive salesmanship on the part of Gazprom and its subsidiaries, Bulgaria and Russia have now signed an intergovernmental agreement that will allow South Stream, a competing project to Nabucco, to be built in Bulgaria. These are just a few examples. I think they're significant of the pressures that countries within the Southern Energy Corridor face when dealing with their powerful neighbors. Taken separately, these developments may seem unrelated, complete with their own political rhythms, commercial rationale, and strategic importance for Europe. But taken together, I think they represent a tangible sign of Russia's persistent influence over its energy-dependent customers inside the EU. When talking to Americans and really trying to crystallize what plight these countries face, I often like to create a counter-narrative. And I say that imagine in your own mind what the reaction in the United States would be if the residents of, say, Minneapolis had to chop down trees in their public parks just to stay warm in the winter because Canada had gotten into a dispute with Mexico over the price of natural gas deliveries. For Americans, this is sometimes hard to imagine because for us, energy relationships and a lot of the good work that the Energy Department here in the United States does is really focused on the commercial side of the business. But in Central Europe, these commercial elements of the energy business take on very real and severe geopolitical connotations. That's the challenge that the European Union faces. It is little wonder that exposed states like Bulgaria view Russia and the prospect of energy alternatives as presented by the Southern Energy Corridor in very different terms than even their fellow European Union member states, countries like Portugal, where these issues are not as relevant. So that's the bad news. A lot hasn't changed since 2009. Now for the good news. First, the January 2011 agreement between the European Union and Azerbaijan, which began to really benchmark exactly how much energy would be provided for projects like the Southern Energy Corridor, that was fantastic news. Taken together with potential reserves in Kurdistan and possible offerings from Turkmenistan, we now have a much better understanding of precisely where Europe will get the energy that it needs to supply these projects. This is a very significant development. Equally significant, and the issue of China and Turkmenistan has come up, and it's important. Equally significant in all of this is that China, one thing we miss on this relationship between China and Turkmenistan is that it took the Chinese 18 months from inception to ribbon cutting to complete their infrastructure projects from Turkmenistan. I am a very strong supporter of the European Union and of the transatlantic energy relationship, But I have to say, it's difficult to get the European Union to do as much in 18 months as it was for China to actually complete and have an operational pipeline. This is the challenge that Europe faces, because as it reaches east and south to energy supplies beyond its horizon, it's going to find that its strategic competitors for these limited resources are thinking bigger, acting bolder, and investing on a scale that, quite frankly, the Europeans aren't necessarily ready to match, dollar for dollar or euro for yuan. Nevertheless, further downstream, we are seeing a lot of very positive developments. We've already mentioned them. We're witnessing the steady, long-awaited arrival of country interconnectors. These will ultimately unite disparate national gas transportation networks by allowing Central European states to trade supplies among each other in the event of an emergency and trade commercial quantities of natural gas on a more regular basis. And for the very first time in October, Hungary and Romania finally connected their national gas transmission systems. Additional interconnectors are currently slated for completion. We've mentioned a few of them. The links between Croatia and Hungary, which, if all things go well, should start operations later this year. A possible interconnector, again, with Hungary and Slovakia, currently under feasibility studies. And, of course, an additional link between Romania and Bulgaria and the Turkey-Greece-Italy interconnector. Clearly, these are significant developments. So when we add them all up onto the grand balance of what's changed, what's not changed, what's good and what's not bad, I think we're starting to see that some positive signs can be divined. Nevertheless, the proliferation of these new interconnectors, thanks to financial assistance from the European Union, is welcome. This infrastructure was not in place in 2009, and I think if we look back, the impact, severity, and scope of the Russian-Ukrainian gas dispute would not have been as stunning nor as severe today as it was in 2009. If it happens again, Europe could be better equipped to handle these consequences. But I think that's what energy security really looks like when it comes down to it. When the unexpected happens, the combined coordination and cohesion of European Union member states from an organic level, not a top-down, but a bottom-up reaction with the infrastructure to actually respond to these unforeseen events when they occur, Libya is another example, really allow us to, for the very first time, glimpse what a real, meaningful energy security future for Europe will look like. And finally, and it is so important that I know we're talking about the energy corridor, but the rise of unconventional shale gas resources inside Europe, I believe, has the potential to be a game changer with immediate relevance for the Southern Energy Corridor. Essentially, you could spend months in a conference and go through books on the technical specifics of these new extraction methods. Essentially what we're doing is we're squeezing blood from a turnip that was long ago thought to be squeezed dry, or finding a new basket of turnips far below the earth where drillers had previously feared to tread. In a country like Poland, which has a smaller utilization rate of natural gas, but nevertheless significant import dependence on Russia. In the case of a country like Poland, you have a variety of estimates. On the low end, we're looking at 3 trillion cubic meters of natural gas. That's the conservative estimate. There are other estimates which actually believe this number could be quite higher. And not just in Poland, countries like Hungary, potentially, Lithuania, potentially. There are a number of new avenues. I say that unconventional gas could be a game changer because when you start adding this up, 3 trillion cubic meters of gas could supply a project like Nabucco for 100 years at its largest projected capacity. Is it possible that 10 or even 15 years from now, which is realistic, we will look back at this period with an eye of nostalgia for all of the effort and controversy invested on projects like the Southern Energy Corridor or South Stream? If so, then Central European member states will need, with the help of the European Union, will need to overcome a number of persistent problems. Very briefly, these include market fragmentation at the national level, the patchwork of energy regulations, even under the third energy package. There's a lot of room for individual countries to employ their own interpretation of how these regulations will be implemented. And of course, we need to increase the ability to move natural gas supplies across national borders, not just east to west, but south to north and north to south. And I think maybe that was where we were looking at when we talked about what the next phase, even before we've completed our current one. If the legacy of the prize of Churchill's venture was mastery of the seas, then I believe our own generation faces an equally significant and complex policy puzzle, mastery of our own need. But a venture is never without risk, setback, or unexpected detours. So in this case, I think Europe and the United States are equipped for the challenge. On the supply side, something that we could also implement, there's been a lot of ideas thrown around, long-term contracts with non-EU energy suppliers should be more flexible, easing take-or-pay stipulations, and, this is important, far more transparent. I often wonder why it is that NATO allies can share sensitive military information over operations in Afghanistan or ongoing operations in Libya, yet they're restricted from actually sharing information about their contracts with Russia when it comes to energy deliveries. One solution could be to enact a minimum level of transparency and reporting in international energy contracts. This system would be important not only so that European countries could know exactly what the nature, specific terms of their deals with Russia were, but it would also add a lot of clarity as to Russia's ability to provide and fulfill long-term contracts through ventures like South Stream. On the demand side, I have no doubt that European efforts to increase cooperation and coordination will help to steadily, sometimes slowly, produce a more robust and predictable energy space. But with consistency and uniformity of regulations implemented across borders, we could begin to see this come into fruition. If successful, unbundling efforts, interconnectors, and clear rules for the operation of public and private energy businesses will go a long way towards limiting fractures among domestic gas markets and in realizing that long-delayed goal of a common energy space inside the European Union. Despite these challenges, we can now look back and see miles of troubled road in our rearview mirror. We can look forward and see that prize, that very elusive prize of meaningful, durable, and sustainable energy security. Like I said, I promise to leave on a good note. Dangers abound, but I think we're beginning to be better equipped to deal with them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, for what I thought was an excellent overview. And mastery of our own need. I think that's something I may have to steal from you going forward. I like that.
That's a great quote.
Over to you, Adnan.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really glad to be part of such a fascinating panel. What I would like to talk about is Russian-Turkish energy relations, as I do think that this is an area that will have quite significant implications for the Southern Corridor, and actually could have even broader implications that I'd like to refer briefly. I think that it's kind of an interesting period to be examining these relations, partly because a lot has been happening in the past 2 years. There's been something that you may call it a marathon between the two capitals, where presidents, prime ministers, and energy ministers have been flying from between the two capitals, basically, on a very regular basis, basically something that is at a very unprecedented level, at least for the past 2 decades, and especially from Turkey's point of view. And the main question that I'd like to address is, where exactly is this energy relationship between Russia and Turkey headed? Is it headed towards some kind of a partnership that could have some potential implications for the Southern Corridor? Is it headed towards something even bigger than that? In addressing this question, what I'm going to do is I'll try to do that basically in 3 steps. First, I'll go over one major theme. This is basically what drives Turkey's energy diplomacy abroad. The other theme that I would like to go over is what is on the negotiation table between the two countries when it comes to energy matters. And after that, I'll try to address this specific question. Now, starting with the first theme, what drives Turkey's energy diplomacy? Now, I didn't think that I need to go over in detail what drives Russia's energy diplomacy, because that's an area that is widely covered and has been actually rather more stable, as a very active energy diplomacy has been part of Russia's foreign engagement for several decades, including from Soviet period. But in Turkey's case, what you can notice is there is an extreme high activity, or what I would call very proactive energy diplomacy in the past 2 years. And it's really interesting to ask the question, what has happened that has made Ankara so proactive? Certainly there are some very common answers to that, such as growing energy needs and basically the expectation for an expiring gas contract with Russia, and suddenly the emergence of Iraq as a possibility for gas imports to Europe and so on. And an additional common proposition is that Europe's attention to the southern corridor has gone up very significantly in the past 2 years, especially after the Ukraine crisis, certainly. So these are certainly, these do provide part of the explanation, but I would like to offer two additional explanations. And one of them is basically that we are talking about a much more consolidated bureaucracy, energy bureaucracy in Turkey. And this consolidation has been gathering speed for quite a long time under the current government. But especially 2 years ago, Turkey did have a slight cabinet reshuffle. And Turkey ended up with a new energy minister and new foreign minister. And apparently the level of coordination between them is much stronger than before. And this kind of emerges as a factor, as a driving factor for a more proactive diplomacy. But let me go to a second suggestion, which I would say is also quite influential in what drives Turkish energy diplomacy. And that is, I would say, the private sector. Now, the private sector, the role of the private sector has been discussed at various forums when it comes to Turkish-Russian political, economic, and overall relations. But I would like to emphasize one particular point. That is a particular segment in the private sector. These are energy media conglomerates. That would be the word that I would use, that are very highly active in lobbying for certain projects to be realized. And by certain projects, I mean one of them is Samsun Ceyhan, another one was, or it still has been, the nuclear power plant projects in Akkuyu in Turkey, and another one has been development of gas or oil in Iraq. And in each of case, you do have one major energy and media owning conglomerate that is very strongly lobbying behind this. And the government has been partly responsive to that, but also partly of its own initiative and wish to become major negotiator in international energy matters. Now, moving forward to the second theme, which is what is on the negotiation table between Turkey and Russia when it comes to energy. Well, if I would like to summarize with one word the Turkish perspective, especially, that would be rebalancing. And what I see is that from the Turkish perspective, there are two problems in the current disequilibrium. And this is basically, on one hand, energy relations with Russia are contributing to a huge trade deficit. Last year, Russia contributed to about a quarter of Turkey's trade deficit, and the year before was even more than that, 35 up to 40% about 2 years ago. So this is a huge problem from Ankara's perspective. And energy imports like oil products, crude oil, and natural gas are the primary cause for that. But there is another source of imbalance that is perceived from Ankara, and that is when you look from there, they see basically that there are companies in Europe, German, Italian, French companies that are actively involved in joint projects with Russia, either in upstream or other projects, but you don't really see a Turkish company doing that. So the hope is that there will be some kind of a rebalancing of the energy relations. Now, what exactly is going on? There are plenty of issues which I would not really go into detail, but I will just touch upon. When it comes to gas, there is a negotiation about a contract that is expiring this year, a gas contract for 6 BCM. Then there is a negotiation for revising the existing terms of the contracts, such as making them more flexible, as Gazprom agreed to do that a little bit to some extent last year in Europe with some of its contracts like with E.ON, basically allowing more spot market index sales. Then there is negotiation about about take or pay penalties, and then there is negotiations about Gazprom's demands to get involved in Turkey's downstream. This is establishing a storage facility, purchasing gas distribution networks and also building power plants based on gas. So this is in case of gas. In case of nuclear, there were quite intense discussions until last year, especially when they culminated into the signing of a state-to-state agreement allowing Russia to build Turkey's first nuclear power plant. And this was basically an agreement that was not really based on a competitive process. Simply at the end, the government decided to award this deal to Russian companies. And without getting into the details, what I would like to say is that the core of the negotiation is focused on two projects, though. I mean, these other areas are quite significant, but the core of the negotiations is focused on two projects, and these are the Samsun-Ceyhan oil pipeline project and the South Stream project. There is this expectation, which has been voiced even at the official level from the Russian government, that Russia wants Turkey to provide permission to build the South Stream through its economic zone, and Turkey in exchange wants to receive support and especially to receive crude oil commitments from Russian oil companies for the Samsun-Ceyhan pipeline. Now, I will go a little bit slightly into detail later on this, but overall I would say that there has not been significant progress in this negotiation on these two particular matters, and progress in one of them is very much dependent on progress on the other one. So the question is, the two countries have, when it comes to these two principal matters, they have reached a deadlock. And you can realize that there is a growing frustration about that. 2 weeks ago, when Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan visited Moscow, Deputy Prime Minister Seçin for the first time, he was openly declaring his frustration. He said that we are not able to understand why Turkey is not providing the permission to construct the South Stream. I'm sure that these frustrations were told to Turkish officials much earlier than that, and there was no outcome coming until that point. And so Seçin, I guess, ended up telling this publicly. Now, where exactly the two countries are going to move ahead based from this deadlock? I'll try to answer this question by providing the longer-term view first, and then going into slightly more into details. I do think that it's important to recognize some longer-term constraints or factors that are affecting the bilateral relations overall, because energy relations to some extent are driven by how the two countries' relations are evolving. Now, in terms of where could Turkish-Russian relations move in the future? I mean, that is one big question. Especially, it's a big question currently when there is widespread discussion about Turkey's future foreign policy orientation. I mean, is Turkey's foreign policy shifting away from its traditional pro-Western orientation or not? That is kind of a major question. I'm not going to address that question, but that is a major question in the minds of quite a few people. And especially within that period, it's quite important to understand where exactly these bilateral relations could be headed. Is it possible that Turkey and Russia are headed towards some kind of a partnership that goes much beyond energy partnership and might turn into an alternative for Turkey in terms of its traditional cooperation with the West? In answering this question, I would just refer to two forces, two countervailing forces. These are the forces, I mean, it's in a typical way of political scientist method, I would say forces of continuity and forces of discontinuity. Now, in case of continuity, you do have some historical constraints here. The two countries have been, pretty much have always been competitors in the surrounding regions, in the Caucasus, more recently in Central Asia, and also they have been competitors in the Balkans. And if you look at history, I mean, I've been able to find only two brief periods when the two countries have actually reached some very high degree of cooperation. This is 1833 when the Ottoman viceroy to Egypt revolted, and Turkey found no support from the Western countries and decided to get Russian help to suppress it. And then it's 1919, 1922 during the Independence War when Russia provided military aid to Turkey. But except this, these are the two exceptions. Beyond that, it's mostly has been about competition. And there are certainly a lot of things that the two countries do not see things in the same direction, such as the Karabakh question, and I don't need to get into further details into that. But then there is there are certain, I would say, two significant forces of discontinuity and could really lead to some surprises. And starting, the first one would be that Turkey is currently ruled by pretty much a new elite. I mean, the new elite does have a very different worldview about what Turkey's relationships with the rest of the world should be. And it also has a very different self-perception, a self-perception that Turkey needs to be a regional power, more independent, and so on. And the second force of discontinuity, I would say, is the weakening checks and balances in the Turkish political system. Traditionally, you have had some forces that have provided this continuity. One of them has been the military. Not the ideal checks and balance in the political system, but it did serve this role to a large extent in the past few decades. Then another one, even more important one, is the media. Currently, a huge chunk of the media has stopped any criticism of the government in any matter. And there is also one large media conglomerate that continues that, but has received a tax penalty of close to $4 billion, which it is trying to avoid in some way. And finally, the judiciary. I mean, in Turkey's case, it has the recent constitutional changes are going to apparently make the judiciary even less independent and much more dependent on the executive. So, with weaker checks and balances, the space for surprises has become much bigger. And that could have an impact on Turkey's overall relations with the West and overall relations with Europe in general and with Russia. Now, coming back to this deadlock, how the deadlock might be resolved or whether it's going to be resolved. Now, one reason for the significant delay that has occurred in resolving this deadlock between South Stream and Samsun Ceyhan is because the negotiations have moved from the top level, that is Prime Minister or presidential level, down to the bureaucracy. And in both sides, the bureaucracy knows that the cost of a compromise is extremely high. Now, from Russia's perspective, Russian companies are asked to fill a pipeline that they are not really willing to do. It's just too expensive for them to fill that pipeline. They have much cheaper options. They do not suffer from bottlenecks currently and are not expected to suffer from significant bottlenecks. Just look at what is going on currently in terms of infrastructure investment in Russia. There are two pipelines that are being built, two major pipelines. One is the ESPO in Asia, and the other one is the Baltic Pipeline System 2. And both of them will have a combined capacity of 130 million tons. They will clearly not need this pipeline, will not need to direct their crude oil to this Samsun Ceyhan pipeline. And from Turkey's perspective, giving support to South Stream does involve very significant risk for jeopardizing its role, its ambitions to play a role in Europe's energy security through the Southern Corridor. It is a significant risk, and there is quite serious awareness in both capitals that Nabucco and South Stream are not really likely to happen at the same time because of market limitations. They are targeting the same market. But having said that, this is basically an indication that it's very hard to resolve the deadlock. But there is, I would not really predict that it will be resolved or not resolved at this point. It's too early to say that. Because of I would just have one major word of caution here. My word of caution is that in both countries, the leadership has been able to go ahead and ignore, at some points, the input that has been coming from the bureaucracy with the knowledge on the matter. If Russian companies are asked to contribute to Samsun Ceyhan, it will not be their first time that they are asked to contribute to a project that they don't like and that's too costly for them. And if Turkey decides to jeopardize Nabucco for the sake of Samsun Ceyhan pipeline, it will not be for the first time that the government is doing something extremely controversial by its own decision. The main example would be the nuclear power plant from last year, which was awarded to Russia without any competitive process. And more recently, despite calls after Japan's crisis, despite calls for evaluating this deal, the government's response has been completely negative. So this is basically my summary.
Thank you, Adnan. I thought that was very interesting. Turkey being incredibly important as the sort of main route, the artery for the Southern Energy Corridor that we've been talking about. And there's this great question of, how reliable an artery is it moving forward, looking forward, especially as a big rationale for the Southern Energy Corridor is, of course, the perceived unreliability of Ukraine and other potential routes. So thank you for that. I think I will begin by using my chairman's prerogative to ask a sort of more general question of maybe all the panelists could just give a very brief, 2 minutes or something on it. We have talked about the Southern Energy Corridor. We've talked about Europe's energy security. We've talked about Turkey and Russia quite a bit. We've talked about the United States' role. And I think we've covered a lot of bases. I felt it would be important, however, to, before we open it up to the floor, quickly cover one base that I don't think was talked about as much as it ought to be, which is, of course, the role of Caspian producers. We talked about the key role, Andrea, I think you talked about the key role of Turkmenistan, and where goes Turkmenistan, so goes the sort of scale of the Southern Energy Corridor. And so to use that as an example in this question, but please feel free to speak about Azerbaijan, of course, and also potentially Kazakhstan and other potential producers. But in the case of Turkmenistan, is there not a push and pull in that on the one side we are talking about the Southern Energy Corridor and Nabucco Trans-Caspian potential. On the other side we're talking about TAPI and pipelines in the other direction across Afghanistan. So is there a mixed message to the Caspian producers? How on board do you think they are? And moving forward, do we need to perhaps concede a bit of the impetus for the Southern Energy Corridor to those who actually have the resources? Perhaps you'd like to begin.
Sure. I guess one of the things that I was thinking about when I thought about a phased pipeline was where the sources of supply are. I think that there are significant sources of supply among the Caspian countries, as well as Iraq potentially, and as these countries come together and decide that that's a viable market, there will be a ramping up of interest, I believe, in sales. I think that Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan have issues about the Caspian, and there's a broader agreement that they probably need to sign that doesn't involve delimitation of the Caspian. And so those are issues that come up when you talk about Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan. Kazakhstan is, I think, a little bit further down the road, but there is potential there as well. So there's significant gas potential and maybe even more once you look at shale gas resources. So I think that that's a pent-up source of supply that is going to be looking for a market, and it's just going to be a question of timing, and when that supply will come together to come down that route and offer a new diverse source of supply, an increasing source of supply for Europe.
Thanks. Very briefly, Peter, Adnan, you'd like to add anything about Caspian producers?
Ultimately, just very briefly, I think that Caspian producers are going to face increased competition from markets. You know, you spend a lot of time, and this is a standard issue that is the duality of European energy security revolves around. We talk a lot about this security of supply from Europe's point of view. Suppliers like Russia and the Caspian producers constantly return with a very valid point. What about security of demand? There are a number of alternatives to the old adage that happiness is multiple pipelines. Today, happiness is multiple pipelines, unconventional gas in your own country, LNG terminals. There's a lot of ways for energy happiness. And these are ultimately going to create challenges, competitive pressures, and new incentives to lock down long-term target markets. Ultimately, that may not be beneficial to consumers, but that tension is where we are right now in the policy puzzle. And I don't know how we go forward. I think a lot of the Caspian producers are going to have to answer these questions themselves, whether or not it's going east to hungry markets in China, markets with the ability to pay, or west to equally significant markets in the European Union. That's for the producers to decide, but the gas world specifically is evolving very rapidly, and pipelines are quickly becoming one of many, no longer the sole way to unite consumers with supply.
Well, I guess part of your question, or the main part of your question, was about Turkmenistan, as far as I understood. Now, regarding Turkmenistan, what I could say is that about 15 years ago, there was this big rush for supplying Turkish market. At that point, Turkmenistan was among the main prospective supplier versus Blue Stream, and Blue Stream won at that time. And it seems to me that Turkmens still have not drawn the lessons from this experience, and I don't really see their policy proactive enough. I mean, their assumption is that they have gas pretty much for everybody in every direction, and it's true in terms of reserves they have that, but in terms of development it's a different story. And in terms of finding the outlets, leaving it to others to find a solution to come and get your gas is not really a solution at all. And that's been, to a large extent, that's been the approach. And currently, I guess, some of the better signs that there might be some progress is, Barroso's visit a few months ago, and some agreements between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan to talk about these issues, or to start thinking and finding solutions about these issues. But I still see that it hasn't been a very proactive policy compared to Moscow's highly proactive and very aggressive policy for selling its gas abroad.
Well, thank you. In the interest of getting as many questions as we can, I may take a group, depending on how many there are. But please go ahead. I think I saw this arm first.
Everett Loya, U.S. European Command. I have two questions. The first for Peter and the second for Adnan. Peter, the question I have is, given the traditional tie between supplier and buyer for gas markets related to the transport infrastructure, do you see sort of a virtual fungibility of gas coming to Europe? And do you see that happening with the transport infrastructure that the Russians are heavily trying to buy into Europe in a way that would appear to give them the advantage in playing buyers against each other? Or do you see it more quickly coming through European efforts to create alternatives within their own transport infrastructure where they would be able to choose between suppliers? So that's my first question. The second one with Adnan is, you mentioned briefly the potential upsetting effect of Iraqi sources of energy for Turkey. My question would be, given the lessons of 2009 as far as Europe is concerned, does Turkey see problems with greater dependency or long-term relationship with Russia as far as oil and gas supplies? And given their burgeoning commercial interests in Iraq, which are growing very quickly, do you see that as a possible alternative for them to have a more independent energy policy that isn't so heavily dependent on the Russians?
Let's see, let's maybe take one more if there is one. Any takers, sir?
Hi, Nikos Tsafos, a natural gas consultant with PFC Energy. I guess the question I wanted to ask is, when you think about the Southern Corridor and having some experience advising some of the companies investing there, you talk about multiple pipelines, multiple routes, multiple sources, multiple end markets, multiple regasification terminals competing. And I was wondering if each of you could offer a view as to what the Southern Corridor actually looks like, say, in 2018.
That's a great question. And maybe, Corey, you... as long as it's short, because we don't have too much time. Thanks.
Hi, this is Corey Artaş from the Turkish Embassy. Since we talk too much about Turkey and Russian relations, just a very brief comment. First of all, I don't know whether the sources of discontinuity in Turkey are there or not, but certainly we are happy with the result because we see nothing wrong of having good relationship with the Russians. We see Russians as a reliable energy partner, and they also see us as a reliable consumer. On the issue of checks and balances, I also wonder what kind of checks and balances a military can do in terms of defining an energy policy of a democracy. So this is a clear question. On Southern Corridor, our support is clear and sound. Our energy diplomacy is not increased in the last 2 years. It has a decade-long history. Remember BTC, remember Blue Stream. BTC was a dream pipe, but we did it together with our US counterparts and with Georgians and Azerbaijanis. As long as the markets will make a favorable response on Nabucco, as you said, we will be fully behind it, and equally we support the ITGI. And hopefully, I agree with you that this Southern Corridor will realize. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'll bring it back to our panelists to answer whichever questions they like, or whichever pieces of those questions they would like to answer.
I guess I'll go very first. Thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. You hit on the one subject which I didn't, and I'm glad you brought it up. Supply ownership, ownership of transport infrastructure, spare reserve capacity infrastructure by non-EU state-run interests. This is, quite frankly, one of the most complex and frustrating challenges any supporter of European energy security faces. The third energy package started out as a remarkable piece of legislation. By the time it filtered through the various layers of implementation and ratification within the European Parliament, it ended up with a number of loopholes, footnotes, backdoors, and ultimately it now is up to the member states to choose how they want to enforce it. Important in that enforcement is whether or not the European Union will take an aggressive or mild approach to the issue of so-called unbundling, whereby a company like Gazprom cannot produce, transport, own the production, transportation, and supply infrastructure all along the route. There are new loopholes for state monopolies to subvert this vision. And ultimately, that's going to be the problem in countries like Hungary and Austria, which are emerging as significant gas hubs, and also for countries like Bulgaria, where the new joint venture between the Bulgarian energy interests and Russian energy interests will facilitate Russian gas, if it happens, through South Stream. Merging principle with reality, merging objective and implementation, these are very, very troubling problems. I think the member states realize this. I think that they want to solve these challenges. But at the end of the day, there are some very powerful financial incentives for companies to subvert and delay implementation of these rules for as long as possible. This is a challenge that individually and collectively member states are going to have to take up. They can use far more support from the European Union at a top level. And from a U.S. point of view, I think we have an interest in harboring and securing the energy security of very significant U.S. allies. Often we forget that these are American allies that are exposed to these vulnerabilities, and they can use our help. However, we can help in husbanding policy initiatives, in providing U.S. leadership. It's amazing how much gets done when the vice president or president shows up with an idea. Take Vice President Biden's trip to Budapest just a few years ago. So I think there's solutions. I think there are ways. And on question of 2018, it is probably one of the most significant and challenging things for anyone sitting on a dais like this to predict the future. I often think, though, about Nabucco and what the Southern Energy corridor will look like 8 years from now. 8 years is not a long time. That being said, the old saying goes, nuclear fusion is the energy source of the future, and it always will be. Sometimes when you follow Nabucco, it seems like Nabucco is the pipeline of the future, and it always will be. Hopefully by 2018, the Nabucco Consortium will finally have some real pipe, not a phantom pipe, and suppliers lined up. They're taking excellent steps to do this now, but we'll see. 8 years goes fast, and maybe 18 years. We'll see.
Since we're going in order, I think I was only asked one question, which was on the what the southern corridor will look like in 2018, and I like to steal a phrase from my colleague Ambassador Morningstar, who is who followed these issues for a long time. His prediction is that we're going to see a pipeline that takes the best aspects of all the projects. I'm not sure how exciting that is to pipeline sponsors or engineers, but it is something to think about. There are some very interesting aspects of each of the pipeline projects, at least TAP, Nabucco, and ITGI. And especially if you think about them phasing in over time and looking at becoming a much larger project over time, you may see something of the Morningstar prediction come to pass. I think that when you look at the economics, I think you do see that maybe this large-scale pipeline, given the timing and the constraints, may not happen as quickly as folks would like to see gas moving from that region. So that may be a limiting factor. But what the U.S. government would like to see is the gas moving. So a pipeline that takes the best aspects of these projects, that looks at a way to phase up, would be what we would see as moving forward on a practical basis. So now we'll see what the market sees and what we eventually realize.
Adnan?
Well, starting with the question about Turkey's dependence on Russia, whether that's a concern or not, and whether that's going to have an impact on its gas relations with Iraq. Well, it is a concern for part of the establishment, as far as I follow. But you also see in the meantime some opposite signs as well. The dependence on Russian gas is over 60%, and there is certainly this attempt to diversify gas imports, whether it's going to be through Iraq, through additional imports from Azerbaijan, and so on. But while there is this dependence on gas and also on oil, which is not that significant, I guess, because oil is a very fungible commodity, while there is this discussion, very widespread discourse in Turkey that Turkey is overly dependent already on Russia, then you see last year the surprise that the government decides to award a nuclear power plant to Russians without any competitive process. So that, to me, is an indication that dependence on Russia when it comes to energy issues is not really the primary concern for the top leadership, at least. Whether it's going to have an impact on Iraq, I do think that Turkey has adopted a very, again, proactive approach when it comes to Iraq. Instead of having conflicts with northern Iraq, especially, it has adopted an approach to expand its investment in the region and to engage them. And it has been quite successful. Turkish companies have been among the major investors, including in some of the energy projects. So I do see that there might be some future about energy imports from Iraq in the form of especially gas imports. Although a lot of it will depend on Iraq's internal politics, how these revenues will be split between the center and the KRG, and then what part of it will be used for domestic power demand, and so on. So it's not going to be an easy question to resolve. Now, the question on the military in Turkey. When in a democratic system, certainly the military should not be part of the checks and balances. But what I'm trying to say is that in the past, the military was indeed a part of the checks and balances when it came to foreign policy making, at least in terms of Turkey's foreign policy orientation, and also even in domestic politics, which is, of course, not acceptable in a democratic system. So what I'm trying to say is that as this is being removed, it does leave some uncertainties about the future and leaves the space much wider open for surprises. And regarding the question about 2018, it's really very, very tough question to answer. What exactly 2018 would look like? I mean, I have this sense that it is likely that the history may repeat itself. I mean, 96, 97. These were the years when there was very heated discussion about bringing Turkmen gas to Turkey, and at that point Russian gas won again. And this time Russia does have a lot of things that can offer to Turkey in the form of fewer take or pay penalties, more flexible contracts, and so on. And it may have some impact on the future of South Stream if Russia really decides to go with South Stream eventually. It may. I mean, I do see that in this whole discussion, it's very, very wide open at this point. It's completely hard to predict what will happen in 2018 in terms of these two pipelines, Nabucco versus South Stream.
Thanks. We have very little time, but I did want to take maybe two very, very quick questions. Yigal, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, Yigal Schleifer with the Eurasia Net website. Actually, I have two questions, but I'll do just one for now, which is for the Undersecretary and Mr. Doran. When you speak about shale gas environmental concerns and how those might play with it, both in the United States, but especially in Europe, where perhaps regulatory concerns and environmental movements might be even more powerful or stronger. So just comment on that, how that might affect the shale gas issue.
All right, last chance for the very quick question. I'll take that as going back to the panel. That is a fascinating question. What happens to shale in the European context?
Sure. I think certainly the question of the environmental aspects of shale gas has come up in the U.S. context, and the EPA has a study going on right now. There is no proof that there's any adverse environmental effects on water, which has been the principal area of concern. But certainly we want to make sure that is evaluated beyond any reasonable area of concern, because certainly the excitement about the gas and the opportunity that it creates for the U.S. cannot overshadow the environmental aspects of it. So EPA's got a study underway. I should have brought the timing on when that would be completed, but we are looking to that for a final definitive word. And they are working with many of the states where the shale gas is being developed. But there have been some studies done already, so that it isn't going to be not expected to break new ground. And at this point, the answer is no significant environmental effect.
Looking at it from a European point of view, this is certainly an issue at the forefront of policymakers, not just in Brussels, but also in Warsaw and elsewhere in the region, especially among countries which may or may not. And again, no, shales are very different, so you can't compare one shale to the other, but may or may not actually have recoverable and economic reserves. That being said, there's some pretty great video on YouTube and elsewhere of people lighting their kitchen sink water faucets on fire. Ultimately, perceptions and reality don't necessarily line up when it comes to shale gas. The science is emerging very quickly and is actually quite reliable. And the companies themselves realize that the greatest enemy in developing new resources might not necessarily be the scientific or technical impediments, but public perceptions and popular pushback against their efforts to develop lasting energy security for countries like Poland and elsewhere. So I think by merging these together, by learning from some of the best practices and lessons learned from the United States, particularly in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, and by actually, this is a great example where we talk about transatlantic energy relations and cooperation, and it sometimes sort of almost seems threadbare. This is an example where on environmental questions and on doing it right, the United States and Europe can actually help each other.
Well, that is a great note to end on. Thank you to the panelists, and thanks to all of you for coming today. If you could just join me in a round of applause for everyone that's spoken today. Thank you.